We all know that for great birds in flight photos, you have to have the right settings, fast shutter speed, continuous autofocus.
But just having the right settings doesn't guarantee you a good birds in flight image.
So in this episode, we will share with you the true secrets of capturing amazing birds in flight photos. So obviously for great flight shots or great action shots, we need high enough shutter speeds to freeze all that action and high enough ISOs that allow us to actually maintain those high shutter speeds. But what else?
In addition to a fast enough shutter speed, we definitely want to use the right autofocus mode. Now, back in the day with the DSLR cameras, we would definitely be using servo tracking, AFC, and we still do want that continuous focusing. But these days, we probably want to enable that eye detect mode.
Definitely, and that has enabled a whole new world for us for birds in flight photography. It was so hard in the past to somehow keep your autofocusing field or your zone on the bird, have it not jump onto the background, whereas now most cameras can just pick up the bird and track it all over your viewfinder. So there's a lot more opportunities for amazing birds in flight now.
Absolutely. Now, another thing you want to think about is the frame rate of your camera. Typically, we want to use the highest frame rate possible, but there is a little asterisk beside that. Depending on the camera you use, you need to know whether you're going to get acceptable amounts of rolling shutter or not.
Definitely. Usually you want to have at least 20 or 30 frames per second because you get so many more wing poses. Unless you're probably shooting something like a hummingbird that has super fast wing movement, because then the rolling shutter effect can come in and it can heavily distort the wings. Or if you're shooting something that has a lot of straight lines in the background, like a lot of trees, they might be all on an angle if you're using the electronic shutter mode. So in most cases, I would recommend using the electronic shutter unless there's a specific shooting conditions where using the first curtain electronic shutter or the mechanical shutter makes more sense because you don't get that distortion from the rolling shutter.
And if you're using one of the really top of the line pro cameras like the Sony A1, you won't have any rolling shutter most likely anyways, so it doesn't matter. So know your camera and know whether or not you'll get that rolling shutter or not. And one other setting you might want to consider is on the lens itself. Some lenses have a focus limiter. So if you're only trying to photograph birds that are decently far away, you'd want to select that range. Or maybe it's that middle range that the birds are trying to fly through. So setting that can really help that lens focus that little bit quicker and maybe get you the right shot.
So these were all the obvious ones like the settings, the autofocus, but what does it truly take to take incredible birds in flight photos? Because it's not the settings. Everyone can set up the right settings, but it doesn't mean you get a good photo.
Well, there's the settings, the camera settings, and then there's the setting, the place you actually put yourself. So whether or not the conditions are right, if you're actually in a good place to potentially succeed, that is maybe the most important thing of all.
Totally. You want to find a spot that is quite reliable. I think it's not very common that your eye would go out, walk around, see a bird, point up the camera right into the sky, and then get an incredible birds in flight photo. That would be very rare, or less than 1% of our flight photos are probably done that way. So you do want to find a reliable spot where there's reliable action. You know the birds are coming back and forth.
You definitely need a decent amount of action in order to give yourself some chances, but you need a few other things too. Obviously, let's say I'm on one side of a pond and there's some birds flying around, but I'm shooting straight into the sun and I have no way of accessing the other side of the pond. That's not going to work. Just having the birds there flying isn't going to be good enough. It might mean, though, that I acknowledge that and say, oh, it's the afternoon now, I'm going to come back tomorrow morning and try this. That might be the technique. But you definitely need a reliable spot and workable light angle. And what else do you need, Jan? Just the light angle's not enough. Sometimes another natural phenomenon can get in our way.
Wind is very important as well because birds, like airplanes, like to land and take off into the wind. So you do want to make sure that your light angle and the wind angle come from the right position, because otherwise you only get bum shots. So ideally you want to have the sun behind you and the wind also behind you, because that means the birds will land and take off towards you.
The other thing that the wind can really help you with is sometimes you have a really fast flying bird, but if they're flying into the wind, it actually slows them down a little bit. It makes it a lot easier to track them. I would say that the ideal situation for photographing birds in flight is where the birds are flying into the light angle and also into the wind. That means as they come into your perfect shooting angle, you have a nice angle at the bird. If the light is like this, by the time they get into the perfect shooting angle, they're already past you, and it's kind of just like a butt shot. We want the bird flying into the wind, flying into the sun, and then we have the best possible chance to get a great photo.
What we also need to do is position ourselves in a good spot. Like ideally you want to be at eye level if you can, or even a little bit higher than the bird. For instance, you could be on a cliff or on a hill, because it often will allow you to have a nice distant background, because I think that's quite important with flight photos as well. First of all, if the background is far enough away, your camera will not get confused so much, it will jump onto the background all the time. And secondly, it will just look nicer with a more distant background.
I would say when you're starting out birds in flight, it's not so bad to try some slower flying birds against a blue sky. You'll have a higher hit rate, it's more fun, you'll have some success. As you move along, the definitely wow factor shots are, things where you have a bird flying against a complicated background, a nice green distant background or something like that. Those are harder to achieve. It's harder to find the bird, it's harder for the camera to lock onto the bird, but those are the really, really wow shots. I definitely used to fall into this category where I thought, well, I really only want to shoot in direct sunlight when it comes to birds in flight. But that's not really always the case, at least not these days anymore, is it, Jan?
Now I think sort of lighter overcast light can be really nice as well, because it doesn't give so many shadows on the bird. Because sometimes in sunlight you can have a perfect pulse, perfect everything, but you still somehow get a shadow from the wing somewhere on the bird or something, and that doesn't look as nice. So especially if you don't have a sky background, with sky or water, not having sunlight is difficult, because then it's just sort of gray and it doesn't look nice. But if you have a nice sort of tree background or like a meadow behind the bird, overcast light can be amazing.
And of course, another thing that makes that possible is that nowadays, with the better sensors and the better image processing that we can do, we can bump up the ISO. So it used to be, if it was kind of overcast, I'm never going to get that 2,000, 4,000th of a second shutter speed. But now you just crank that ISO up and blast away.
And the good side for birds in flight doesn't necessarily always mean that there's 100,000 birds flying past all the time. Like you might have a puffin colony where you have that, but sometimes there's sites like that spot where I photographed the peregrine falcons or the ospreys. I know the birds are there, but they don't fly past all the time. It means you have to be ready, stand there with your camera with the right settings, and then suddenly out of nowhere the bird will come by for one quick flyover and you have to take your shots during that time. So being ready and having a spot where you know this can actually happen is quite important.
Yeah, it's actually funny that you mentioned peregrine falcons. When I was taking this photo of the peregrine falcon here for the cover of my book, I was sitting up at this cliffside where there was a nest down here. It was so hot. I had to hike up to the top, like we talked about, getting an elevated perspective and just wait for hours. Sometimes the birds would be off hunting, nothing happening. And then you'd get 5 seconds, bird flies by. Okay, now we're going to wait for another few hours.
With these examples, the most important thing is that you can control your camera blindly and you can find the bird in the viewfinder within less than a second, I would say. You probably have 2 or 3 seconds of the birds flying past you. So within the first second of you spotting the bird, you also want to be able to rip up your camera, have it in front of your eye, and when you look through the viewfinder, you also want to have that bird in the viewfinder. So I think this is something people should practice all the time. They can practice that at home. Grab your camera, point at something in the distance, and then without looking through the viewfinder, point your camera towards that spot. And once you look through the viewfinder, you want to see whatever you pointed the camera at in your viewfinder. And if you don't see that, you want to practice until you're actually able to rip up your camera and have whatever you pointed at right in the middle of your viewfinder.
Yeah, this is probably the biggest thing that separates a really good bird in flight shooter from an average one. And what I call this is eye lens coordination. So where, yes, you can see that thing and I'm on it. And the more you practice, of course, the better you get at it. There's some things you can do to help you though. For example, if you're using a big lens or a lens with a hood that kind of rotates, often there's a little knob. You can set that knob as almost like a gun sight, and you can kind of sight down that to try to find the bird. But another thing that is so important for birds in flight, a technique thing, is pre-focusing approximately at the distance where you think the bird will be when you lift your camera. It's so important. If you think the bird's going to fly by and be 20 meters away, you pre-focus at approximately that distance so that when you lift it up, it's not just a blurry, totally out of focus frame. You'll never find the bird there. It's not going to happen. You need to have the bird at least sort of in focus for the camera camera and for you to be able to see it to then autofocus on it. So pre-focusing, anticipating the action, using the right settings, being in a good spot, these are all the things that are going to lead to those great shots.
And sometimes you can take amazing flight shots in not very obvious spots, because often when we're out in the outback photographing at these cattle troughs, for instance, they actually allow you for some great birds and flight photos, because you usually put up a couple perches at these troughs, and then there's like 1 or 2 dead trees kind of nearby where the birds will land and stage in. So you see the bird in a staging tree, and you can see it taking off and flying towards your one perch, and that, especially with the mirrorless cameras these days, allows you to quickly jump onto the bird in flight and then get some really cool images while it's flying in. So it's not always that you're standing on some cliff or in the middle of nowhere waiting for something to fly by, but you can almost create good birds and flight setting at certain setups like these water spots, because you can predict where the bird's coming from, and it can be quite rewarding. If it's a busy day and there's 10, 20, 30 birds coming in, you get an endless amount of amazing flight shots opportunities. And this is where the eye tracking really helps, because usually you can pick up the bird just mid-flight and you get some really cool images.
Okay, so let's summarize some of the key take-home messages when it comes to getting great bird and flight shots. Obviously, we need to use the right settings. That goes without saying. We have to be able to dial in those settings and control our camera. We need to find a good spot. We need to be in a good spot where there's enough action with good light, birds flying ideally into the light angle and, in a perfect world, into the wind to slow them down. We want to use good technique. We want to pre-focus in an area approximately the distance we want to pick the birds up. We want to pick them up early, track them into our sweet spot, and blast away. We want to use the highest frame rate on the camera, as long as we're not getting too much rolling shutter. And, of course, practice makes perfect.
And of course, like with all other photos, we also need to have the right editing technique to get the most out of flight shots. And it's mostly like editing your other photos, but there's often a small little differences, because you might want to bring out the clouds in the background more, or there's a shadow on the bird that you want to lighten up a little bit. What are some of those things that you think are a little bit different when it comes to the editing of birds and flight photos?
You know, obviously birds in flight, when you're trying to just do the best you can to track them, you probably don't have the perfect composition right out of the camera. First of all, it's not a bad idea to shoot a little bit loose with birds in flight so that you have some room for the bird to move around while you're tracking it. If you wind up with an image where the bird, for example, is maybe too close to one edge of the frame, it's really nice to know how to add some canvas and to do so in a perfect, convincing way.
And sometimes it may happen that you even clip a little bit of a wing, for instance, and this is something else that you can fix up pretty easily. And especially it's important that you may not delete some other shots that have the part of the wing in the shot, because it's very easy to grab one shot that has a perfect pose with the clip wing and then a bad pose but that has the top of the wing, and this combine the two to get an image that has the whole bird in it.
Yeah, I think those are the main ones when it comes to birds in flight, is making sure that you got the raw material, you got the bird in flight in focus. Now, I might have to just add some canvas and work on the background a little bit to make sure that, you know, I can get the whole image. Actually, on this recent Brazil trip, we were shooting these beautiful black-collared hawks flying down into this river, and they were hunting. And I got some cool sequences of the birds kind of coming in and grabbing the fish. Out of the camera, the raw images weren't as presented. You know, the bird was close to the one edge or whatever, but I could just simply add some canvas, clean up the background a little bit, and then wind up with this nicer final shot.
And I think that's important that you learn some of these skills that you teach in your ebooks and I teach in my masterclass, because it just helps you to get the absolute most out of the images, and even when the shot's not completely perfect, make it perfect in the end. And of course, our pro sets will also allow you with just one click to transform those flight shots.
So another thing that often really helps when it comes to birds in flight is understanding the bird behavior and predicting when they're going to fly. I talked about in one of our last videos about this opportunity that I had when I was recently in Brazil for this Toco toucan. And because I knew that the bird had been feeding at this certain fruiting tree, I had a very strong suspicion that it was going to continue to flying over there. So I ran around to get around the light angle, and just as I got there and got set up and pre-focused approximately at the distance I thought the bird was, sure enough, he shot out of the tree. I lifted up, my eye lens coordination was on the money, and I got the shot.
And this is especially important as well if you're on a cliff to photograph like eagles or peregrines or ospreys. they do usually come by in like a very similar pattern. For instance, when I'm photographing the ospreys, the one osprey always catches a fish, always flies to the same branch, and then from that branch flies to the water, has a bath, and then flies up and back to another branch. So it's actually a very predictable sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 stop pattern. So if you position yourself in the right spot and then just wait for it to get ready, that's how you can get the shots. Whereas if you're just standing somewhere, you have no idea at all what the bird's doing. It's a lot harder. And I think one area, if you want to practice just birds and flight shots, finding a good busy duck pond, like for instance, there's heaps on Vancouver Island or that rifle bird sanctuary in Vancouver. That's where I took a lot, or I learned a lot of birds and flight shooting, because those ducks just fly from the left to the right all the time. So you can position yourself on a nice low angle even, and then just practice, practice, practice. And that will help you to then also be ready to photograph some more difficult birds in flight.
Okay, well, we hope some of those tips help you to get some fantastic shots of birds in flight. And now I think it's time for everybody's favorite segment, the photo of the week.
The first image I brought is of this awesome looking dusky eagle owl from India, and I liked everything about it. It's beautiful light, it's a great pose, it has those really big ears, it has those bright yellow eyes, and I don't even mind the a little bit more sort of busy background. There's just one thing I'm not entirely sure, which is just that sort of branch going right behind the bird that somehow makes it look like the bird's connected to the perch. So I'd probably work on that a little bit.
Yeah, I definitely agree that little nub of a branch probably would be better if we took that out. And one thing I noticed, I don't know if you felt like this, but to me, I felt like the bird's almost leaning back on the perch. So maybe rotating the image a little bit clockwise would help with that and give it a slightly better presentation. But overall, a really nice shot. Okay, so the first image I've brought for us this week is of this really cool owl species. I'm not sure what owl it is, but I actually like how this image is smaller in the frame, and it was probably spotlit, not with flash. It's because there's this sort of vignetting effect around the outer parts of the frame, which I think is quite cool. But let's play the game. Jan, what do you think that I might do differently in this image?
It's an interesting one. I personally would have cropped it maybe slightly tighter, but there's also a couple of these sort of red thin branches going right behind the bird, so I'm not sure whether you feel like maybe they should go, especially the one coming right out of the bird's head.
Yeah, I think that some or all of those thin little branches need to go. Definitely some, definitely the one coming out of the bird's head, definitely the one right in front of the bird. And overall, though, it's a really cool shot, and it's a different shot. It's not just a tight portrait. It's a little bit wider, and that's why I like it. But I think just a little bit of cloning could clean it up a little bit.
The second shot I brought is from Landmosphere, and it's of this scarlet honeyeater feeding on this beautiful purple flower. I don't think it's a native flower. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but I think it just looks really nice. You have a bit of that blurry foreground. You have that bright bird with that bright flower, and actually that quite strong contrasting green background. Just an overall quite nice image, I thought.
Yeah, I'm always torn when there's this, there's sort of out of focus foreground element that sort of obstructs the shot. I'm not sure that I want it to be over the bird's tail. Like maybe if the bird was a little bit higher up and there was sort of out of focus stuff, but the bird was actually still above that completely. It's not really covering the tail, but do you know what I'm saying? Just if it was a little bit higher. But overall, it's a really nice shot of this little beautiful little scarlet. What is it? A scarlet honeyeater. All right, the second image I've brought for us this week, well, it was an episode about flight photography, so I better bring a flight shot. This one is by Mel Weber Photography, and I think this is actually one of those great examples of when you're going kind of against the standard rules of light and things like that, and it winds up creating a really cool image. So this swift being kind of side backlit with the light coming through the wings on that super dark background actually makes a really dramatic and very beautiful image, in my opinion.
Definitely works well because it's a really cool banking pose, and you can kind of see the sun shine through the wings. If that was a normal wing down pose, it probably wouldn't work. So the pose here is really what makes this shot. With these kind of shots, I always wonder how black the background was like when the image was taken. So I'm sure it was darkened a little bit in post, but it definitely works. It makes a great effect, so I don't have any problem with it at all. And I think it's an overall really cool shot. The last shot I brought is Definitely technically not necessarily perfect, but I thought it was just such a cool scene of this marsh warbler feeding this ginormous cuckoo on this branch. I'm like, it's just a very unique scene. You see some of these shots sometimes, but this is definitely a very nice and clean shot. I'd probably be tempted to maybe slightly work on that sort of bright reed background, but overall I just thought it was a very cool shot.
And yeah, I think the key here with this image is it's not about the perfect perch, the perfect background, or that. This photo is about and does a good job of conveying is that natural history behavior of this nest parasitism. And in that, it does a great job. And for me, the last image I've brought for us this week is by Warbling in the Woods, which he calls Johnny Pumpkinseed. It's actually a Blackburnian warbler. A very nice, clean shot of a beautiful species of bird. Nice singing pose, nice, the way the bird's positioned on the branch. It's not what I would consider to be sort of my favorite style of perch. It's sort of just a kind of more bare stick. However, the shape that it makes and the side branches, I think makes it overall a really interesting image. What do you think about this one, Jan?
It's interesting because without all these branches, the image would look quite bare. But I'm also slightly confused by all these branches going in all these different directions. So I'm still figuring out what I 100% think about this image. The post definitely great. It's really nice with the big open. The colors are beautiful. So overall a good image, but yeah, I'll need a couple more minutes to decide what I think about all these branches.
Well, we hope you picked up a few tips that will help you out with your birds in flight photography. Remember to consider those conditions, the angle of the sun, the angle of the wind, find those really good spots and then practice that technique and definitely practice that eye-lens coordination. And that'll really help you to get some better birds in flight shots.
So make sure to let us know in the comments, what is your experience with birds in flight? Have you learned something from this episode? Give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and we will see you in the next video very soon. Bye!
See you next time, guys.